Our next featured guest is a leader at both Publicis and in the industry for her bold strategy and investments. Here to share her seasoned viewpoints on the effective use of digital audio with clients that include New York Life and TD Ameritrade, with Dana Elmquist of New York Public Radio, please welcome Vice President and Strategy Director at MediaVest Spark, Anjali Martin.
I have to say, I had that music, anhedonia, for sure, when I was pregnant with my son. It would like Clockwork Orange me. I was like, oh my God, please turn it off.
All right. So, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
We've got a bunch of questions here. We're going to take questions from you guys in a little minute, but I get to ask the first 5 or so. So I just wanted to start with saying we could kind of celebrate this moment for 30 seconds. A couple of years ago, New York Public Radio didn't have anything that Spark MediaVest really wanted to talk to us about, but now they do, and it's been a really fast-moving trajectory. You guys have included us in several different buys and really engaged with us in a sustained dialogue about this fast-evolving space. So part of your purview is to, I guess I would frame it as, taking measured risks with new clients and really looking at new media, evaluating new media, and positioning it to clients. So how did you begin to look at the podcast space? How did you benchmark it? And what are your preliminary conclusions?
Yeah, so I think with the digital audio space in general, when it kind of came to us from a strategy perspective, it was very much so like the full episode players, FEPs, and digital, and like the expansion of video from TV, where it was like to extend scale and reach. And so it was kind of like an addendum to some of the buys, get brands into this space and kind of see how it performs for them, their receptivity to it, and so forth. But what we started to see pretty quickly was, at least in the podcast space, but just in like talk radio as well, is that it's a different audience and it's not about scale. It's, you have to understand what the role is of the space, and we kind of went in the wrong way. Whereas the FEP video space, it is about scale, and you will get that extended reach and the adaptation of consumer behaviors there. What we saw was that, there's a definite role for it, and it's all about, this is what I'll say, it's like the digitization of audio and terrestrial audio, in that it's very similar to, the benefits of it are very similar to the DJ endorsements and the things like that you get from terrestrial, and the power of the influencer and like very authentic, almost natively integrated endorsements throughout makes it that much more compelling and engaging. And we really needed to see that before we could actually, revise what the role was and go from there. And I think what's key is that you kind of have an expectation of what it'll be like, you kind of dabble in it. But then you have to have the chance to revisit it and actually come up with a recommendation of the best way to use this and what have you learned and why. So I think that just assessing the landscape, what we wanted to do is say, okay, anytime a new media comes out, is what is it most like? How could it potentially help us deliver on the strategy before we can decide if we can test it at this point in time and not, and then start to formulate like an approach that, okay, for a few months we'll try this, do we have the assets and all that stuff, and kind of minimizing the risk as much as we can. When we went into the podcast space, what we started to see is that actually, I know this never comes up, but it's very similar to print in that it has the opportunity to talk to the long tail in a way that we don't really think about anymore. And I know that's like dating me in my media career, but it's very much so that long tail element that, the very niche audiences, and it's opt-in, and it's potentially even more efficient than other places and spaces we can get that long tail. So how do we think about that as being the benefit? And then starting to think about what's that story we would tell to this person if we could afford to, and how would we adapt? So that's kind of like the way that we went in and started to test it out.
Cool. So you mentioned endorsement. That feels like kind of a baked-in ad. Talk to me a little bit about sort of baked-in versus, dynamically inserted. Does that matter? Does it vary by client? What's your feeling there?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it really varies by brand. Again, take every brand situationally. I've had experience in a lot of them. And some have, like retail, has a lot of urgency with a lot of the messaging. They're going to want to try to drive something specific. And they want you to take an action pretty quickly. So I get the need for dynamic, and it's really important. And more so, it could help not only from a period of time, but as it becomes more evolved and sophisticated, this space, it's also just editorial alignment and things like that. So I get that, and that's awesome. What I also think is that we have to be cognizant that there are some brands out there that aren't urgent. Like, I work on New York Life now. It's like a 16-week lead time to like purchase, like when we think about underwriting and all that stuff. Quick pro out there, everybody should have a life insurance policy. But it takes a long time. There's no reason for us to say, hey, I need a dynamic insertion, and I need it in this for this period of time, because it's about building a brand. It's about being top of mind to an extent, and it can be for an extended period of time. As long as we keep it fresh and the content isn't repetitive over and over again, there isn't a reason that we can't have that long-term relationship, because it's not going to be irrelevant in 2 weeks, 3 weeks time.
Got it. So you mentioned New York Life specifically. In terms of finding audience that can buy a premium product like that, maybe premium cars, maybe luxury goods, is podcasting actually there in terms of delivering that kind of an audience?
Yeah. So at MediaVest Spark, we just had a podcast day. So lots of learning on, just who the audience is. And every meeting we'll have in the industry, you'll talk about the affluence of this consumer who's listening, and very much so mirrors some of the talk radio stuff as well. And so beyond that, they are a highly qualified consumer. I mean, from a financial perspective, affluence is great. Age, there's a diversified age. I was working on some ad council stuff too, and we think about opt-in, medium, and the reach. When we were quoting the numbers on the age up to I can't remember the percentage, but the percentage of people from 12 to even 54, there's college kids you can now target, which we've had struggles with in the past. There's men that have always been an issue from a multi-touch point marketing plan solution. How do you actually engage with men in an effective way? That's always seems to just be sports, but now there's a really great way to actually tell a story and engage with them. But the space in general, I think, it's very qualified in that we're seeing that they're willing to take action. We saw that today. We looked at those numbers, and we talk about digital audio today and music and evoking emotion, and it has that recollection. But something like talk radio and in podcasting, it's very informative, and you're leaning in, you're listening because you want to be educated or inspired, or you're just genuinely intrigued, and that has another element of openness, and that just kind of by association, affiliation of the storyline that's happening, it really helps drive and convince people to take action.
Got it. Cool. Now, since we are at Audio Day and we're talking holistically about audio, does the on-demand music complement podcasting or compete with it? Are they on the same buy? They're different use cases,
Right.
So.
Yeah, so I think that's on point. Different use cases, so different roles, and again, it depends on your brand objectives. What are you trying to do, and what the brand is? But they complement each other, right? There's a place and space for general audio. We've talked so much about, from the evolutions of the in-home devices like Alexa, enabling audio listening to be more swift, but even just having the exposure, having music on as this soundtrack to your day, that in itself inherently implies that it's also always on in the background. And that's different, and it's more about keeping top of mind awareness and evoking that connection, like the McDonald's example. It's top of mind awareness, and that's a different goal and a different priority than if you're trying to, in the podcasting space, you have the chance and the opportunity to use an influencer to educate, to drive consideration and relevance, and actually convince someone, which is why you're seeing that action being taken, is that there's an actual convincing and so forth, that it has the time, right? With podcasting, you don't have the restrictions of 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and so forth. You have the time to convince them and tell that story. So I do definitely think it's complementary, and there's not always a need for both. but understanding that they are different, that you don't just think digital audio and lump them together because they are very distinguished roles.
Cool. All right. Let's dive into measurement a little bit, because I know this is something that we've talked about a lot. It's something that we've tried to get out in front of to a degree with dynamic insertion on our end, where we can track impressions. But certain players within the industry are moving measurement forward through pixeling, through being able to retarget those consumers, where we can actually have some sort of real channel attribution and find that person later on in their sort of purchase cycle. So is this obviously making it easier to position it in front of clients? Or what are you really seeing in the industry? Where do you think it's going in the next 6 or 12 months?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lack of measurement, but I think we all have to be careful with the data paralysis too. And even if we had the world of measurement, what would we do with it? Would we act differently? Would we behave differently? How would our recommendation really change? So I'm totally for measurement, or totally for the data, I would say, to be able to target better and so forth. And the accountability is great. But it goes back to the role and what we're starting to see. And until we get there, I think the biggest issue with a lack of data and measurement is the discoverability of a lot of the podcasts. There's so many out there. How do you know which one's right? How do you know how to target them? And a lot of our the industry partners and the vendors will help us decide which ones are best for campaigns. But that's where there's a huge opportunity, more importantly, because you can clearly see how your plan would change if you could discover and understand which partners you would use and which narratives and shows you would align with and things like that. From a measurement and accountability, it's great, but think about the role. What I'm saying to you, I guess, today is what I'd love for you to take away is from what I've learned and what we're starting to see is the real power of podcasting is in the influencer and who's in the storytelling there, that native and authentic integration, and ultimately the content, right? The content that comes with that. Or if you're not just, I'm saying create a podcast, by no means am I saying just go do that, because there's 350,000+ of them. Be mindful of when you do that. But it's more those are the opportunities. It's not just we're precision targeting here, that we need the data and the measurement to be able to optimize. It's storytelling. Treating it that way, like you would a content partnership or a larger program and so forth, will help you deprioritize or figure out what are the must-haves in measurement versus the nice-to-haves, and understand, where that's going. And I will say, from the discoverability perspective, in our podcast day, PodTrack came and we grilled Mark, and we were just so excited, and we totally geeked out on the opportunity to just calculate numbers differently. And I'm just really stoked by what they're doing in this space and how they're just kind of trying to push the industry. So that way maybe one day we will think of the pixeling you're mentioning about, the data, using it differently from a front-end strategy perspective as well as a reporting perspective on the other side.
Agreed. And I think from a publisher standpoint, being able to find people outside of the existing podcast funnel to grow our shows will really only benefit both sides of the equation. So you warned us against creating our own podcasts, but that's what everybody's doing. So why are they doing it? What makes a really successful custom execution? We've seen, GE, we've seen Goldman, take somewhat different tacks on that. Obviously, it's not for every brand, but what makes it work?
Yeah, I think, if you have, again, we've talked about it, if you have a story that you want to tell to people and you haven't figured out the best way to do it because it's a niche audience, or there might be just, people don't care about it. You think about mass media, it's really about just awareness or just getting your brand out there. And it's more when there's a point in time that you might consider a brand in this product category, consider us, right? But what this allows you to do, having your own podcast, is if you really have a story to tell, with GE and stuff, that can connect with the values and the passions that your consumer has, and will actually show them that you know the technology, that you know the storylines, that you've done your research, so they're not questioning things, then go for it. It's a lot of resources, it's a lot of time, there's a respect, right, that you need to refresh it, that you need to continue to have that quality. You don't just do one episode and done. So if you have that, that's great, but it's a matter of understanding what is what's that insight that you have that's unique about your consumer, and can you craft a content program for them? How do you sustain it? And then I think it's just a matter of what matters to them, and really making sure that it's different. With 350,000 other podcasts, could you not pair with someone else to enhance a different one? Or where is, like, I would actually say that the real opportunity for GE and so forth is the data collection, post the downloads and stuff, if they're promoting it elsewhere. Are you going to get the data on people that are essentially your most engaged, most valuable consumers and do something with it, whether it be retargeting them elsewhere, serving them additional information? Because if they're really engaged in what you stand for, then awesome. But it's a lot of work, and just don't fall out and just stop it. Stop continuing.
Agreed. I have a theory that it could be all an HR play to get people to actually work at some of these companies.
But that's an effective way. Like, if they show off your tech, show off your talents.
Agreed. So what about programmatic? That came up during Audio Day at the agency. You think there's a role for sort of a bifurcated approach where you buy some specific shows and then add scale through a programmatic complement?
I think it's a balance. I think it's both. It's, when we talk about there's an opportunity to get some scale, especially if you're not just going to partner with the top 5, right? After that point, it is the long tail. So how do you aggregate that scale? So using some of that is great. But if we talk about the real opportunity is going to be aligning with the influencers and the shows and getting that piece out there, that in the end of the day, depending on how you use it, every brand is going to be different. Some just want to be there. Then I do think that there's a huge role and opportunity to continue to, show by show, like, have those bullet points, have them experience and talk and endorse it, because especially with the real long tail consumers that you want, you need to make it relevant to convince them to do it. And it depends. Like, is it an expensive product, a cheaper product? Like, will anyone buy it? Is it easy to explain? Is it harder? And in which case, you owe it to them to then take the time to do that. Or you can have the more it's a mix, like generic messaging, like we talk about retail. If there's an urgency, you just want to get out there, you would have that resonating, why me, why better, but it's also like, do it today. Go today, visit today, and all that stuff. And it's both messages work hand in hand.
Agreed. Any questions from the audience while we're... Oh, we don't... I'm getting the signal. We don't have time. One last question while I've got you, and then we'll close this up. On the way down here today, you discussed thinking about a custom play that would really sort of go across channels. Maybe that would take the influencer and their audience from a podcast into other media. Maybe it would move the other direction and sort of build their brand into podcasting as potentially a spokesperson for a company. Is that something that you're thinking about, a way to integrate the celebrity and the sort of personalities that happen through audio organically into other media?
Yeah, I think, not that I needed this, let's be honest, but I think if how we have decided at MediaVest Bark to really prioritize podcasting is, and this is brand by brand, but collectively we kind of see the opportunity here is going to be in the content space. And what we're starting to do is think about, our content partnerships are holistic. We think about all the touch, but think content first. What's the unique insight? What's the consumer message you want to take away? And then think about the mediums that are best ways to deliver them right after the fact. And so if you think about it that way, podcasting is an element to deliver. And whomever and whatever company and brand will help us deliver that story best, whether it be us or a partner and so forth, is going to help us get there. And in what's ideal is if you partner with a bigger brand that has multi-touch points, or you have that influencer who may have that scale or reach, as long as it works together seamlessly, every element has a purpose, that you're reinforcing the message by using the influencer in their audience, or you're extending it into, just like with podcasting, there might be print extensions, there might be TV if you're got a really good budget, and or things like that that'll help tell a really big cohesive story, that the experience for the consumer is what you're leading with and what's that insight. And then you understand if you're talking parenting and you're talking about tips, you need to know where that parent goes for tips, and that's going to be the messaging there. It's not going to be the same in every environment. So as we think about podcasting and how we can extend those influencers, we are very much so thinking of what's really the best place for the content to be created first and the insight to be delivered, and then how could it manifest itself throughout other touch points to just amplify it and create a conversation versus just a push conversation.
Cool. All right. Thank you again. This is really, really, really helpful.